So today I want to give kind of an update on the anti-tracking stuff that we're doing in Firefox, point out things that we aren't exactly sure what to do for a couple of things, and kind of pose that as, hey, this would be awesome to have input on. So to get started, I probably don't need to convince many folks here that the web needs some type of default on-tracking protection, but I like to show a slide like this just in case, because it shows how horrible things are, right? You connect to 4 websites and there's 300 different third parties almost 300, right, that you're connecting to. And right now, in most browsers, there's not really much stopping them from tracking you, right? If they choose to set a unique cookie, they can do that, and they can track you across websites if they happen to be embedded on more than one, which many are. And it's not really just cookie tracking that's a problem, right? There's kind of 3 classes of tracking that I like to think about. One is like browser state, right? Actually setting an identifier on the browser. The next is browser fingerprinting, IP address, all of these stateless identifiers you can use to identify the browser. And the third is identity. And so I'll quickly talk through these 3 areas and what Firefox is doing in each of them and where we could use some help. And I also want to make the point that these 2 areas are kind of the only place we can control. Tracking with identity, and this is the example there, is like collecting someone's email address and using that as the identifier as opposed to generating a random one, right? It's hard for us to control that because email addresses go everywhere, and they should. You know, if someone's signing up for a mailing list, it should go to a first party. So we have limited ability to influence those areas. But let's start with cookies, right? And the first thing you might think is, let's just block all third-party cookies. Well, we did try that in May 2013, and we postponed it. And now it's 6 years later, and it's still postponed. But we're hoping to change that, and I'll talk about the things we're doing to change that. But we wanted to look back at that and say, hey, can we actually just block all third-party cookies, right? Can we do that? And as I mentioned before, we have the ability to run studies. So we were able to actually run a study on this now. And what I'm showing here is a comparison of a group of users that had all third-party cookies blocked and a group of users that didn't have any blocking. Right, and what we saw was for the users with all third-party cookies blocked, just over a 1 to 2 week period as people were ramping up and getting into the study, there was a 1% drop in number of in active users for that branch in general, right? And then there was 2 to 5% drop in users who were active for more than 10 hours. And so that was so significant that we just turned off that cohort immediately as soon as we did that first analysis. And so essentially, we're bleeding users if we block all third-party cookies. We know we can't do that. But what we could do, perhaps, is block tracking cookies, and I'll talk about that. But what we see here in that green line on the graph is we actually didn't really affect active hours for blocking tracking cookies. And so I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But the core problem, right, the reason we lost so many users is that this one identifier, one storage location used for basically everything that a website might want to do, right? Cross-site tracking, which is something we really don't want to happen, but also things like ad performance measurement, federated login, first-party login, fraud detection, CAPTCHA, device recognition, right? Analytics, and so many more. And so if you just block all third-party cookies, you block a bunch of these and things break. And so the kind of new approach that we're taking is it needs to be on by default. We don't want users to have to understand that there's a threat out there and how to understand what cookies are and know that they should disable them if they just want a private experience on the web. Like, that's not what Mozilla stands for, right? That's kind of against the mission. We want to block trackers, and maybe we don't block the tracking techniques. And a good example is fingerprinting. It's really hard to change the browser to not be fingerprintable, but what if we just block the fingerprinters? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then not breaking experiences users care about, because as I pointed out, if we do that, we lose a lot of users. And so the first thing we did was we published an anti-tracking policy that basically said, these are the things that might end up with you being blocked or downgraded in some way in Firefox. And basically participating in cross-site tracking, whether it's cookie-based or URL parameter-based. And I won't be able to go into that during the talk, but I have some backup slides if people are interested. And then browser fingerprinting or super cookie usage. So let's start with browser state. Well, like I said before, rather than trying to block all third-party cookies, what if we just block tracking cookies? And we define trackers by parties that are on the disconnect block list. Disconnect does a policy review of seeing, does this privacy policy allow a third party to collect data, share data, and so on. And so we have a list of about 2,500 tracking domains. and we block everything that's on this list, which you probably can't read, and that's okay. It's a lot of things. But it's things like local storage, cookies, broadcast service workers, and so on, as well as connections, right? So we prevent TLS session tickets from being reused. We prevent connection reuse. So kind of any way that a tracker could track you across two top-level domains, we're trying to remove that when we say block cookies, right? And we generally just say blocking cookies. But we still run into this problem that I mentioned before, that some of this, even for those 2,500 domains, the cookies are still dual use. And the good examples to give are Google and Facebook, right? They have tracking cookies on their main domains, and they also provide login that users care about. But kind of the insight we had when thinking about this is that users also interact with those services. So someone's going to go and click on a continue with Facebook or continue with Google button. And what we can do is when we see that click happen, at least during the ramp-up period, we can automatically grant access as soon as we see the click. And I don't have time to go into the details. The links on the bottom of the slides here, you can dig in if you want. But basically, we then unblock google.com, for example, in this example, if someone's interacting with them, but only on the page in which they interacted. So it really limits the scope of tracking. We don't just unblock them everywhere. We block it where they've attempted to log in. We unblock it where they've attempted to log in. But really, we want to move away from this like automatic kind of heuristic style of granting access and move to something a little bit more programmatic. And for that, Apple actually proposed the Storage Access API, and we've implemented it. And basically, it allows an embedded party, when they receive interaction, to say, I'd actually like access to my main cookie jar so I can have the user's authentication cookies, for example. And we've seen adoption of it already. So from large parties. So Amazon Pay uses it right now. Facebook is using it for their embedded commenting, probably other embedded Facebook things. These are just the two examples we know about. So that's awesome to see. And that's allowing us, hopefully in the future, will allow us to kind of expand the set of cookies that we're blocking and remove those heuristics that I talked about. But what does it mean to request storage access? Well, that varies based on browser. In Safari, I believe they prompt on every request, assuming the party making the request had been visited before. So it prevents, some random third party who you don't actually want to interact with from making a request just because they click-jacked that. They just, grabbed your click when you made a click on something else. We don't like to prompt because we don't really know if users will understand this. So what we're doing right now is having heuristics where we have an automatic set of grants on up to 5 sites, and it can go a little bit higher. And the basic idea there being something like Amazon Pay, you're not going to be logging in or paying with Amazon on more than 5 domains in a session, most likely. So if you're Amazon Pay, you'll just work and the users won't see anything. But if you're a tracker who wants to track on every single page and you're trying to track users using this API, then users will start seeing this prompt. So it's not perfect, and we love a better way to say do login where login doesn't cause these prompts to appear, but we don't have that just yet. So moving on to IP address, stateless tracking, I'm going to focus on device fingerprinting. So if you're not familiar with that, the idea is instead of a tracker setting a cookie on the device that has a unique identifier in it, the tracker could read the properties from the device. And this is just giving an example of the type of properties they could read, right? It could be your fonts, it could be your screen resolution, and they could even draw things to canvas and hash that and use that as part of an identifier, right? So all of these various things, using all the various web APIs and just teasing out an additional amount of entropy from each of them. And so fixing all the APIs is pretty hard. And what we're seeing is that fingerprinting use is still growing. So back in 2016, when I measured this with my former advisor, we found that it was 1.6% of the top 1,000,000 sites had fingerprinters embedded. Now that in more recent measurements, that's up to 3.8%. And actually, when we look at the top 1,000 sites in that measurement, we see it on something like 10 to 12% of them. So this is something that users are experiencing every single day, right, as they're browsing. They're being fingerprinted. So we want to do something about that, even if we can't fix all the fingerprinting that's happening on the web. And so what we've done is we have fingerprinting protection now built into content blocking, which is our general kind of blocking tracking cookies feature. And it's available in Firefox 67, which just shipped to users, but it's also on by default in Firefox Nightly, like I mentioned. If you use Nightly, if you want to see the coolest things that we're doing. And the way that we do that is we crawl the web, and we use kind of heuristic-based techniques to look at what calls a script is making, see if they appear to be fingerprinting scripts. I believe Sarah will probably go into a lot more detail on that later in her talk. But basically, we kind of flag scripts as potential fingerprinters. And then we ship that over to Disconnect and say, hey, we think these are fingerprinters. Could you make sure that they're fingerprinters? They do a bunch of verification themselves. And then they end up shipping a list back to Firefox. And they do an awesome job of it. I'm giving an example here on the side of the slide where they do dig into scripts and make sure that they do contain fingerprinting code, and that they do send that resulting fingerprint off to some remote location. And right now that list has 138 verified fingerprinters, and that covers 75% of the known instances from the measurement that I mentioned before. Of course, we could be missing things in that measurement, but of the stuff we know about, we're blocking a significant portion of it by using this block list. And we have had some success in that changing practices. So TinyMCE is an example of an HTML editor. They had a fingerprinting script embedded in it. Once they found out about this feature, they said, hey, we don't want to be blocked. We removed the fingerprinting. Could you take us off the list? So that's cool. But a challenge is a lot of anti-fraud happens with fingerprinting. In particular, highlighting two things here, Stripe is on the fingerprinting list from Disconnect, and Stripe does payment processing, right? If we block that, payments aren't going to go through for users. SIF Science does account defense and also payment processing defense. So again, if we block that, it's going to cause problems. And a specific example is we were blocking Arcos Labs CAPTCHA because they were doing fingerprinting as part of the CAPTCHA, and any user who had that block turned on wouldn't have been able to sign up to GitHub. So like massive amounts of breakage where I can imagine that graph not just being 2 to 5% of users leaving. And so my request for the audience here is a safer way to do anti-fraud. If you're familiar with the Privacy Project, I think it is a nice step in that direction, and I would love to see more things like that allow anti-fraud providers to move to safer techniques to preventing fraud and not just relying on some global identifier that can collect data in any way they wish. And lastly, I want to talk about identity and where we struggle to prevent identity-based tracking. So to give an idea of actually what identity-based tracking is, let's say I'm on this social.example website. They embed into the main context in the page, the main frame, they embed a script from tracker.example. And they also have a mailing list sign up, right? You put in your email, you're just trying to sign up for this social website, everything's good. But then the tracking script says, oh, okay, there's an email in that box now, let's grab it. And then send it back to ourselves and then share it with other folks. And so we see the sending of this, we see emails being sent to third parties. I can link you to some research on that. So we know that this is happening, and of course once third parties have it, we don't know what they do with it, but it'd be very easy to share. And sometimes this happens in hashed form, but hashed emails are kind of just as good of an identifier as in plain text. So what we could do in Firefox is block that script, right? And now we've fixed the problem. We don't have to worry about it anymore. But the problem is there's nothing stopping it from just moving to this, right? PII-based tracking does not use device identifiers. So there's essentially nothing we can do to stop it, right? If the site chose to send the email back to themselves and then run an ad auction on the back end based on that, they could do it, right? There's nothing stopping them. And we would just see, oh, okay, this user signed up for a mailing list. And so solutions to prevent this, if anyone has ideas, we would love to hear them. We're thinking about it as well. And so my ask for you is kind of in summary is help us find better technical ways to do federated login, to do device reputation and anti-fraud, and to do ad attribution measurement. And actually Google and Apple recently released proposals to do ad attribution measurement, which I didn't have time to include in the talk today. Help us find violations of these anti-tracking policies. We're looking for them, and we want to add more people to the block list, but if you find folks that are violating one of our policies and we're not blocking them, let us know, and we will try to do something about it. And lastly, help us explore some solution, maybe it's a regulatory solution, to prevent identity-based tracking. So thanks so much. Looking forward to chatting.